Systems Group, running a variety of projects across the South Australian, Victorian and New South Wales Mallee regions, including 2 projects on soil health and carbon management. And we're particularly happy to be focusing this webinar today on southwestern New South Wales, where we've not had any carbon-focused projects before. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be emailed out to all registrants after the meeting and will also be made available online. Now, is my screen sharing okay, guys? Yeah, okay. On the right-hand side of your screen, there's a chat box. Please do put any questions you may have there, and we'll pose them after the talks. So the webinar today is part of a series being brought to you by the Soil CRC and supported by the New South Wales Government and its Primary Industries Productivity and Abatement Program. The series is all about providing information to land managers about carbon farming and management to help make informed, evidence-based land management decisions. The first webinar in the series was about accessing soils information using visualising Australasian soils and the eSpade tool, providing spatial soil and land characteristics to assist with carbon planning. The second was about interpreting soil data and land capability for soil carbon projects and how to optimise practices for soil carbon. We've since had some more focused webinars looking at soil carbon management in different regions. Links to these recordings are available at the CRC website, and the link will also be provided in the chat. This webinar today is focused on, as we say, southwest New South Wales and the Mallee regions. We've got 2 speakers. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Dr. Karl Anderson, an experienced soils research officer with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and Regional Development, who will give us a high-level overview of what's known about soil carbon in our region, factors leading to loss, maintenance and recovery of carbon in our soils, and also factors to consider in relation to carbon projects. We'll also hear from Dr. Amanda Schapel, who's been working with farmers across southeastern Australia to understand and benchmark soil carbon with a focus on sandy soils. Amanda is based in the Barossa Valley, north of Adelaide, where she works as Principal Officer Soil Action with the South Australian Department of Primary Industries and Regions. And Amanda's talk will focus on how to know if there's potential to boost carbon stocks in your soil, strategies to improving productivity, soil health and carbon stocks in sandy soils, and recent data on situations in which soil amelioration has impacted carbon stocks. So between them, we should be able to get a pretty good handle on carbon in our landscape and best opportunities to manage it. So I'll hand over to you now, Karl. If you want to unmute yourself and share your screen, we'll get underway.
Alrighty. Share again. Okay, trust that's there.
Yep.
All right. Thanks, Nick. Thanks everyone for joining us. I'm very happy to have Amanda presenting with me today. I've worked with Amanda a little bit before, and I'm not based in the region, so I've worked a little bit down there and through there, but a lot of my staff will be sort of talking more generally and borrowing a little bit of information, sort of coming to the area, and a little bit I've collected from them myself, but then some other resources that I picked up from in there. So very happy to have Amanda and then talk and have discussion afterwards. So as Nick said, I'll sort of start off looking in a general sense about what soil carbon actually is and think of it moving through the soil. Have a look at soil in the landscape and what that can sort of show us. Have some examples of regional data and look at the ideas of cycling and where there's been depletion and the ideas of getting carbon back into the system. But also part of that is looking at management opportunities and constraints that may be there, say to production. And then a couple of thoughts on if you're considering a carbon project, some of the ideas or some of the questions you might have around that. A couple of these slides I did have in the earlier presentation, but I thought I'd just go through them again, just nice and briefly. When we talk about soil carbon and soil organic carbon, the focus falls to carbon, but the most important thing is the soil. So I've got to bring it back to that, I think. And the carbon is just part of organic matter, which is the real thing that turns dirt into soil. It makes it that living thing. You can see it. It's the dark stuff at the top of the soil here. So where there's darkness in the soil, that's organic matter. Where the organic matter's gone, or where there is no organic matter, you get iron taking over as a driver of the color. And here it's rusty and red. That means well drained. You can have different colors, yellows and grays and greens sometimes. And when there's none of that, it's just pale, leached. And when no organic matter and no iron, it's pretty much just silica. There's not much in it. Lots of range of color in your soil. Organic matter is what you want. It drives the system. Carbon then, as I mentioned, carbon is part of that organic matter. It basically moves through the soil as bugs are cycling it. Plants are putting it in, bugs are cycling it. It's food for bugs and food and energy. It's nutrients and energy. If you're looking at counting and accounting for how much carbon you've got, you need to know the bulk density. So carbon we get as a percent. What does that percent represent? We need to know how much soil there is. So that's where we get the idea of bulk density. And an easy sort of number to remember if you're thinking along these lines is that a bulk density of 1 gram per cubic centimetre means that there's 1,000 tonnes of soil in a hectare to 10 centimetres. And that means that a carbon stock then of 1%, 1% of 1,000 tonnes is 10 tonnes. So 1 and 1 is 10. And when you're accounting for things, that's what they want. But remember the importance of organic matter. So we, in a general sense, we think of it in different pools. There's a particulate, which is the recent material that's gone in, that gets cycled by bugs. It can end up, with sort of, think of it as long ropes with charges on it. It can get stuck to soil particles, where we call it mineral associated, and that provides a bit of protection. It might be inside the natural aggregates, and that provides a bit of physical protection. And some of the material is charcoal, and that's relatively inert and relatively stable in the soil. How it gets in there in the first place is, of course, through photosynthesis, through our plants. That goes in, gets cycled, might end up as manures, litter, root biomass, and these important exudates from the roots into the soil. The bugs, as I said, they cycle it, turning into organic matter. Most of what they consume, they respire back to the atmosphere. The more disturbance there is, the more aeration in the soil, the more the bugs have a sort of opportunity to get into what's being protected in the physical things, but just also the amount of air that they can be more active. So that leads to more sort of respiration. We have product removal, of course, and hopefully not too much, but we do definitely have erosion losses from the system. Now, as I said, I'll be using a little bit of stuff from outside the area, but this just provides a gross sort of view of how you could see organic matter or carbon in the soil. That first photo that was coming from near 1,000 mils up in the highlands. And you can see it really distinct layering. As we're coming down into the more moderate rainfall levels, into the mixed cropping zone, it's the same parent material, but it's not as dark, nor it is as pale, and not as deep. Similar position in the landscape, these ones, so less weathering. And then again, that same stuff out further, out sort of towards the edge of the rangelands, we just don't have that accumulation at all. So these are things you can see in the soil. How does that sort of relate to our landscapes out here? Two main sorts of things. We've got these alluvial systems where you can think of the stream carrying particles down, the sands and silts and the clays. As the rivers flood, the sands are heavy, so they drop out, and then you carry the silts and clays over, and you get this natural sorting of your soils. And you can see that again from the air, and you'd be familiar with this sort of stuff. These levees, the sands, and then the sort of the redder soils, and then black further away from the channel. Another main component is wind-blown material, resorting of material that's there, and you can see that, you know, in this broad sense of dust moving out of these lakes, and we can see the relics of these sorts of things in the sand dunes across the area. And there's different types of sand dunes. Some of these are linear, east and west, getting blown across, and then these other sort of mixes where they're a bit more parabolic. And I think that sort of relates to younger material that's moving and it hasn't quite broken through yet. So you'd expect different properties in these areas. And some of those properties can be that this is a bit of work that Chris McDonald was looking at on some of these sand dunes, where if there's some salt in them, which there can be, then that can come out down at the breaker slope here. He's picking it up in an EM survey. So they're little sort of small scale changes that you can come from big areas into these, you know, regional patterns, and you can get these differences that play out in that small scale. Another view of looking at some soil profiles down here now is a local difference on a sand dune and the adjacent creek flats. So in the top one, you can see obviously that's close to the creek. We've got our water table sitting there, and again we've got accumulation of organic matter and a pale layer onto the clay. On the sand dune just nearby, interesting thing here, we've got our dark layer at the top, and I'll come back to this thing here where we can see this purple layer, purple material. That's showing a bit of a pH indicator, which shows up as bright purple. In this case, where it's alkaline, high pH, and we can use that as a bit of an indicator in our soil. The thing that was interesting here is that we've got our big difference in pHs, big difference in texture, and a difference in salinity as well. I might come back to some of these numbers, but as we're pushing up into this sand dune here, we're getting some salts accumulating, or salts present in the subsoil there. So while those aren't directly carbon related, they influence and have an effect on plant growth, and therefore the movement of carbon through our soils. Yeah, I'll come back to that fellow, I think. So here's our overall region of MSF, a rough sort of picture there. And we've got a bit of history underlying the region. You might sort of see these broad sweeps up here. And even down here, there's some of these little patterns coming in. They're relics of the old ocean as it was in there. It came as far as Balranald and Upper Pooncarie. There's beach sands, and they might be familiar to you with ideas of mining for rare earth metals, the different materials that we've got there. But yeah, they influence the materials that we've got. There was another system where we had these different faults occurring that was blocking the river systems, and you had big buildups of lakes behind there, and they introduced another sort of set of materials into things like the Blanchetown clays and these limestone layers as the climate went wetter and drier, and yeah, sort of laying these different materials down. And there's those edges of the ocean shores, as I mentioned. Yeah, so anyway, there's different materials that have been laid down in there, and they've been reworked since these lakes have drained, and the climate sort of become what it has now. Moving in a bit closer, again, we can sort of see those patterns there. Like we've got our sweeps of east-west dunes and those parabolic ones that I mentioned, but in the broad sense, you can see those sort of sweeps. And this is just what I'm talking about now is just to sort of help explain or a bit of context to the variability in soils that you have. There's regional patterns before you get down into the local paddock differences. Now, one of the resources Amanda told me about was this Soil Hub. Terrific resource for you down there with a bunch of soil pits across the region with chemical information and physical interpretation that's been provided. And I've just borrowed some of that as a bit of an outline now for some of the soil properties that we've got. And I'll just highlight a couple of those things in here. So the first one here was from Walpiup in Victoria, and a couple of things here. Excuse me. One, we've got really low sulfur, just a little bit in the surface and below reporting or detection limit underneath that. So really just sort of living in the surface for sulfur. P is probably fairly decent for there, but again, low underneath. While the soil is alkaline, we've got a little bit of this acidity just below the surface coming in. And that's something I believe is coming in with farming and especially the high yielding sorts of crops. Ag is an extractive industry. We're taking out nutrients for us, and that means taking out things that leave the soil more acidic, as well as some of the fertilizers and nitrogen cycles can have this effect. So that's something that's emerging and you want to keep an eye on. And especially when it's just underneath the surface, it might sort of feel a bit hidden. The plant can get established, but then it goes down and hits this layer underneath that mightn't be very nice and can sort of pull up. And instead of having a deep bucket, you're sort of stuck in a shallower bucket. So definitely something to be looking at. The other thing I just wanted to highlight is where in yellow down here is these values here. So the cation exchange capacity is a measure, is sort of an indicator of the guts in the soil. It generally reflects how much clay and organic matter to some extent there is. It's the cations, the positively charged nutrients that are on the soil. And depending on how you measure it, you can have artifacts in there. And I think in this one, being a really sandy soil, there was a different test that might have been more appropriate that wouldn't dissolve the limestone, which gives a high calcium, which gives a false sort of high CEC here. So that number is probably actually a little bit lower than what's indicated there. So if you're getting soil tests done, just look at the sort of tests that you're getting done. And we can talk about that later on if someone's got a question. The other really good thing that they provided here was a physical measure. So a lot of soil testing is just sort of chemical stuff. We can dig pits, and having these sorts of ideas have measurements of compaction and sort of how hard the soil is really useful. And we can see here that roots grow through this green sort of soil strength or compaction, density of soil fairly well. But as it starts to get harder and the particles are packed closer together, the roots are finding it harder to find a way through. Water also can find it harder to get through, and you can get sort of perched layers here. So these sorts of measurements, especially sort of picking up in these sands, can pack in, and a mix of sort of sandsill clay can really find, ways you sort of shake it out and just imagine the particles setting together. So that can provide a bit of a restriction in the soil there. The next one from Pinaroo on a dune system, and they highlighted the different layers in the soil here. You can see the darker, the paler, and then we're moving into subsoil with a few different layers of material there. And as the colour is changing, as I referred to earlier, we've got different conditions and we're getting into strong carbonate layers down the bottom here with this pale stuff. A couple of things in here to highlight is at the surface, we've got really low sulphur. We've got more distinct acidification happening. P low at depth again. I highlighted this probable artifact with the cations. And the P here, we've got a few different P measurements, and I'll assume that people got some knowledge of the different P tests. Colwell does one measure of an alkaline soil. This other one, the DGT, is really developed for these alkaline soils where it sort of gets a bit of a slow release form. And here, these levels are really high. And we've got some benchmarks. You can go to a soil quality org or different sources. But once you're getting up into those levels above 60, say, we're not needing P to be applied because we're at our high yields. It doesn't make much difference putting more P on in those circumstances. So we can back off fertilizer in that instance. The thing interesting here also with the sulfur, none at the surface, but increasing with depth. So that might indicate a bit of leaching potentially, or some natural gypsum deposits a bit deeper down. I just wanted to touch on P again quickly and go back to that little thing I showed in that pit from earlier. We have our bulk soil conditions. We also have really fine scale variability, which can be influenced by plants. So plants will acidify their rhizosphere. They put, when they're taking up nutrients, I mentioned those cations, when they're taking up these positively charged things, they balance by putting out a positive charge, which the easiest one is hydrogen, which is acid. So that can acidify the rhizosphere, and the purple indicates high pH and the bluey green indicates lower pH. So we've got rhizosphere acidification, and we can see that in the sign here with some manganese staining. It's a side effect of it. What that can actually do is release some P that's been bound as a calcium phosphate. So it's like a slow release form in these soils. P can be stable, is stable, or locked up, but locked up at high pH, but it can be dissolved by plants actively growing and acidifying their rhizosphere. One other soil from this soil hub was some substantial acidification happening here. Light soils, low buffering, and pushing down into now low pHs here. Again, limited sulfur, decent P, but if you're getting, it's limiting factor. If you're getting some sort of constraint, then it can pull the whole system up. So you need to keep an eye on things, and this might indicate why the roots are so sort of vigorous and then they really fall away. I'm not going too much deeper. So different things to keep an eye on in thinking about growing and having organic matter moving through your soil and your carbon levels. Now, as I said, a bit of information from outside the region, just to give that bit of a context again. Here's a bunch of data. If we look from east moving west, this is carbon levels in the surface. The darker ones are high, moving through green into red is low. General trend falling away to the west, 0 to 10. In the 10 to 20, there's just much less again, which you could anticipate from those photos earlier and the idea about litter accumulation at the surface. If we look at that with rainfall underneath, we can really see the effect of rainfall and how that really drives the system. And then looking at the data-wise, we can see that there's not much accumulation until we're sort of pushing up into 500 mils or so in the surface. And deeper down, the response is even later before we get some accumulation. And for our region, we're looking back here at the bottom end. And this is where Amanda's got some nice local data and looking at the different patterns and sort of ranges that you can expect. Another couple of little plots here of soil running down the, carbon running down the profile. And this is from the edge of the area at Pooncarie. Low levels, 0.2 is low, and not much change, not much accumulation at the surface and just sort of running straight down. In the higher rainfall at Cobar, there is accumulation at the surface. But the other little interesting thing here is this bump out here. Depending on the soil test you get, you might pick up some carbonates. And even when we try to treat them and remove them, because they're inorganic, if we're interested in organic carbon, we try to remove them. But some of the tests, you might hear it as a LECO or a dry combustion or an elementar, that can still have a bit of an artifact of carbon in the soil. So we can fall back to other available tests. Okay, so soils, ideas of where carbon is and moving through. Now, the more the process is this active sort of thing and why we're where we are and what we might do about it. Historically, as ag has been introduced into a system and there's been cultivation and clearing, historically, globally, there's a pattern of decreasing organic matter. There's about half a dozen different trials in this one graph, but consistently, they're falling away. The problem with that is that historically yields have gone with that as well. The organic matter, full of nutrients, as that's mineralized, they're providing that fertility. If that's not maintained, then, and we're losing organic matter, we're also losing that nutrient cycling, which supports the yields, of course. This long-term data is from overseas. We don't have lots of long-term data in Australia, but this pattern is reliable and comparable to us as well. In this system, we've got some mineral fertilizers in the circle, unfertilized in the triangle, and these systems are just going along. This one that's gone up in the open circle is where farmyard manures have been applied to the system. So they've been added in, and then when they were withheld, dropped, and started again, and they've climbed up. And that's a pattern that we can see. The squiggly lines under it is a model they've developed to explain it, but we've got the data that really shows these things. Again, here we've got manures withheld and not reapplied, and the system sort of falls away. So when we have, we're talking about increasing carbon levels in our soil, that really requires less loss, less mineralization, but also more supply, more growth, but continued growth and continued and maintained to keep it there. Otherwise, we get this falling away. The falling away is not necessarily a bad thing. It just means bugs are active and supplying it. It can be a bad thing if you're falling to too low a level, which we'll touch on. So can we rebuild? If you want to look at rebuild, there's definitely lots of examples of accumulation in systems globally and locally. These are from southern New South Wales, but Amanda, as I said, has got some examples for the more local area. So in these sorts of rates, 0.2, half a tonne, pushing up into a tonne sometimes. But in these longer ones, we've got this sort of 0.2 tonnes. Generally, these things are starting at low levels, so there's somewhere to come from. And in this one here, in fact, a relatively recent example, we've got this pattern of what can go up can come down. And we're sort of working in a window type of thing. Excuse me. All right. So this one here was from a long-term trial. It was that one a touch earlier. The increases were measured over a sustained period, over 18 years, but they're mainly restricted to the surface. So that's the whole profile here. An accumulation in the surface and a little bit in the subsurface, but not that much further down. And looking at those two plots, this is the very surface, trend up, got this cycling within it. But in this instance, it was where they'd moved from cropping into permanent pasture over that whole time, and we got this increase happening. The key thing about it, of course, is keeping it there, or at least operating within a window. Here we have some data from a 450 mil rainfall in central west New South Wales, so a little bit higher than we're talking about for you guys, but got this pattern here of increasing carbon levels, which is great in cropping systems, conventional, reduced till, conservation till, and this one here is a perennial pasture in the triangle. So they're all moving up. Even in the subsurface, we've got some increase happening here in the pasture over this 13-year period. But then we have our conditions change, and we've got the bugs kicking in and mineralizing it. And what we don't want to see really is that this measure here is below where we started, or we first took this measure. We'd like to see if this fluctuation is happening, that it's at least stable or trending up. So this is something where you want to keep an eye on it, definitely. That's not unique. Here we have stuff from the Central West. I said in that earlier slide that most of those have dropped back, and some work that we're just publishing at the moment took that then and looked at the value in a carbon trading circumstance. Out of 9 properties, 6 increased after the first 5 years. Only one of those maintained all its increases. One fell away a bit, and the other 4 lost all of their amounts. And if there was a payback required, which can happen, all of those gains, all of those credits would have been required to be paid back. And in that circumstance, you want to think about, well, are you selling, or you want to maintain, or you want to hold them just in case, that sort of thing. I might touch on that a little bit later.
We're just getting close to time here,
Oh,
Karl.
sorry, mate. Okay.
So sort of 5-minute warning, I reckon.
No worries. All right. Grazing. What can grazing practices do? Sarah McDonald looked at a whole range of papers recently. Looked at it recently, published it last year, and found that of all the grazing practices, there's no consistent effect on carbon levels. Definitely on biomass, but actually staying in the soil wasn't maintained. Globally, tillage practices haven't really been found to hold it consistently. A little bit more in the surface, a little bit less in the subsurface. And Fiona Robertson has done a range of things through Victoria, and basically found that it's pretty hard to get cropping practices to lift and maintain carbon levels. One way that they definitely can be held is by increasing the general nutrient level in the soil. The way that happens is that if there's enough nutrients in the soil, then you can sort of build this stable form of organic matter that stays there for a little bit longer. A fair bit longer. The particulate will sort of cycle a bit up and down, but if you can build this sort of humic layer or form, then you get this increase happening. Opportunities for increasing levels are basically low where it's low. The sorts of things I've just been talking about with climate. Local variation, as Amanda will touch on shortly. But the thing that's looming, the whole reason there's this whole discussion about soil carbon is climate change. And as we're going to get warmer and more erratic rainfall, it's going to be actually harder to hold on to what we've got, let alone thinking of lifting our levels. Holding on to it is going to be hard. So what can you do? What can you sort of look at in managing your soil? You want to deal with constraints. You want to deal with hard pans. You can see them, you can feel them. Problem is water getting into the soil doesn't happen. Roots spend all their time running around trying to find a gap through. So that's a problem. One of the good bits about organic matter in the soil and thinking about this water is Rochelle Meyer did some work recently, or a little while ago now, 2015, and she found that more organic matter was worth $25 a hectare per year at Birchip. Better water use efficiency, water in, plants able to access it. So definite benefits there. Some other little tests you can do, looking at the stability of the soil. It's going to work. You can look at how the soil responds by putting in a little dish of water. Dark is organic. Just underneath it, less organic matter. And as quickly as this, you can see what a good level of soil is. This is not enough to keep the soil together, so it will fall apart, seal, water will shoot off. If you've got more organic matter in there, stable, water can get in. Quick as that, you can suss it out. You can do these pH tests yourself, have a look at what your soil is like. That was that thing from earlier. A salinity measure you can look at if you've got concerns about why some plants might be falling over in dune systems. Acidity. Creeping in, as I said, the roots will tell you a story in these sensitive species, really trimming off here. Patchy establishment, lucerne being sensitive. There's our layer that's blocking low carbon levels because we're falling down in this pH, which brings aluminium in, which is toxic. So that's something you want to keep an eye on. And even our sampling depth. So Jason Condon's been doing some finer sampling depth than is commonly done. And in this situation, if you just do an average of 0 to 10, you think it's 5.3 and it's okay. But by what he's finding is his stratification, it is definitely fine at the surface, but it's actually problematic at depth. So by doing that finer layer depth sampling, and especially looking with the kit that you can use yourself, you might pick up some of these constraints. Salinity, as I said, that can be a problem. And where it's a problem is that it basically holds water away from plants to the degree that they can't establish and grow. Plants being there protects the surface, water can get in, you can flush them. A salinity problem is sort of an opportunity really, because it means poor sort of water use and there's improvements to be made in your water availability. So that's a good thing. We want to minimize erosion, minimize losses. You see them. This stuff loses our topsoil, which is the best material. And not just that, but the material in the dust is enriched because organic matter is so light. It's really sort of selectively moved, and a huge amount more gets lost in the dust. So protecting the surface is really key. And we don't want to end up like that. John Lees has got benchmarks. There's some old stuff, but yeah, still holds. How much stubble do we need to minimize erosion in these examples? Looking above a ton, 2 ton to minimize losses there. And in the sorghum, that's sort of more spaced out material, even higher. Okay, so last one, as I said, Nick, I'll just do this quickly. These are the options available through the ERF for what are considered new practices, not necessarily new, never heard of, but new to your area. They fall into different groups: adding ameliorants, changing your system, modifying, like Amanda can talk about, delving, that sort of stuff. All of these are basically agronomic sort of approaches, but basically dealing with improving growth and minimizing losses. If you're considering these things, then you want to ask questions of yourself and a potential provider about what commitment is required to those practices and how long and what risks that might entail, or options if it doesn't actually work out for you, and what costs are involved. The starting point is really important, so you need to understand where you're at. Would they help you take preliminary measurements? I know some do. Sometimes you hear stories that are a bit too grand. These are things I have heard. They guarantee increases, which they can't. There's an infinite capacity of soil for carbon, which there isn't. That adding is easy, which it isn't. And they can just dismiss things by saying an anecdote, which might sound good, but can they be open with changes that will persist? And are there examples that are relevant to you where they've got increases, but also where they may not have increases, and can there be an open discussion there? So there's sort of things you want to keep in mind. Okay, so just finishing up, look at what you've got, your soil, your landscape. Where might you get to? What's a realistic sort of level that Amanda's going to look at? It's about inputs of basically growth and not losing what you've got too much. It's harder to build than it is to lose. We know it's decreased. We do know that there's ways to increase it, but basically manage your system and do the best you can with it, is looking after the soil. Yeah, so I might just pull it up there, Nick, and hand over to you, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Karl. It is great to know that there's someone with that depth of knowledge of soils in our region, and also factors affecting soil carbon. We'll throw now to Amanda for more of a look about how soil amelioration affects soil carbon in our region. And yeah, over to you, Amanda.
Took me a while to unmute myself, apologies. So I will follow on from Karl's fantastic intro to where they are. So I work more in sandy soils in our southern Mallee, upper north area, Mallee zone. So I've just pulled out some examples about some real life changes that you might be able to expect to give you an idea of what changes in carbon may be available. The biggest question I get asked whenever I'm talking at workshops by farmers is, how do I know if my soil can store more carbon? So there are a couple of tools you can use. CSIRO have developed a product called Look-See, and that will give you an idea of an average organic carbon percentage value down to 0 to 30 centimetres. So when we're talking carbon projects, we are talking 0 to 30 centimetres. We often don't have data that deep because all of our agronomic soil sampling is generally 0 to 10. So this is a good one to give you an idea. You can map out your paddock or your farm area, and it will take all of the soil carbon test results in a 100-kilometre radius and give you an idea of what your paddock or your farm may be. So check that one out. Our Department of Environmental Water utilised our soil mapping data, so that was collected between 1990 and 2010, to create an idea of carbon stocks that would be expected. So the graph on the left there shows what the actual carbon stocks are in the areas, and it's a colour-coded system. The area for the Mallee is in that lower rainfall sandy soil. So we're looking at between up to 10 to 20 tonnes of carbon existing in those areas. No brainer that higher rainfall, more systems with pastures are getting much more like between 60 and 100 tonnes of carbon in their 0 to 30 centimetres. So sandy soils do have a smaller capacity due to that protection that it offers. There's also a map there on the right that shows the opportunity. So this is what would happen if the samples that were at that lower end of the zone. So we break everything into percentiles, and we look at our lower limit is our 25th percentile. What would happen if everything from that 25th moves up to what we call a practical target, which is the 75th percentile? And so this gives us an indication that in the Mallee area, we would be looking at, an increase between anywhere between probably 0 to 10 as a confident-ish area if you're at a lower baseline, and maximum up to 20 tonnes if you're on those heavier soil types. Another resource that may be relevant, or you can have a look at, are our carbon benchmarks. So these are based on 36,000 soil test results collected when we used to have a lab assessment. So what we did was broke all of the soil test results up, assigned them to the district that they came in, and again we created benchmarks based on percentiles. The good thing about this is that people are getting their normal 0 to 10 centimetre sample measured in the standard carbon Walkley Black test, and they're able to get their test, have a look at what their texture is. So if I had a loamy sand and I was sitting at about 0.4, I would be around about that 40th percentile. This then gives me an idea if I have any opportunity to move, because we use 75th percentile as our target. If I'm below this 50th percentile, I have an opportunity to increase that lower starting point that Karl was talking about, going up to a practical target. What is interesting though is in the Northern Mallee, when we had a look at these based against standards, that we had state standards for criteria between what was considered low and what was considered high, and we had different criteria for each texture. So if we look at a sand in this Northern Mallee area, over around about 70% of these samples were below a low level. If we move down one of our regions down to the Southern Mallee, we see that there's less in the low area, going more into the moderate. And if we go down one again into the upper southeast area, we can definitely see a lot more moving into that high area. This is purely due to rainfall. So based on that information from rainfall and talking to the carbon farming outreach officers, they wanted a guideline that they could utilise instead of looking at all of these areas, agriculture areas by district. They wanted to pull all the information and get an idea about what it is on rainfall zones. So this fact sheet is available based on 4 soil types. So we've got sand, sandy loams, clays, clay loams and loams, and they are utilising percentiles again. So we've got the lower limit as a 25th percentile, the practical is just 75th, and we've added in stretch target for areas where that you think have that potential to go higher, and that's generally higher rainfall systems with pastures in them. This is those tables in a graphical format. My brain does a lot better with graphs than it does with tables. And what we're seeing here is those 4 soil types that we just explained. So this is again 0 to 10 centimetre samples, organic carbon Walkley Black. We have rainfall down the bottom. We have organic carbon concentration going up the top there. What we see is these lines are that lower limit, 25th percentile. The green limit is that 75th percentile, or our practical target. Generally, you can see increasing rainfall, we get increasing carbon. That's a no-brainer. We just know that that happens. What we do see when we're looking at this opportunity, so that difference between that lower and that practical target, is that at lower rainfall, we have less opportunity, particularly in some soil types such as sands, compared to things like the sandy loams. There's that smaller opportunity to increase carbon. Not to say that inputs aren't occurring in there, it's all about that, what is staying in that soil, so what's not turning over and what's being kept in the soil. So lower rainfall sandy soils are quite hard to improve in a big way. As you increase your rainfalls, you can see that these values increase and that opportunity becomes higher. Around about this 650 to 700 mil, you'll notice that these lines all level out. And this really starts to tell us that rainfall isn't limiting to carbon anymore. So other things such as nutrition and other management practices become important. And that was similar to what Karl showed before. This is a guide. So this is based on those guidelines that we had, and it shows you that carbon concentration, that difference between that 25th percentile and 75th percentile. And you can use them as an idea about what the maximum carbon change you could expect if you're at that lower end, moving to that target end. We're looking at these rainfall zones at this lower, so below that 400 mil. Sands can expect to have an increase of, say, that 0.3% carbon. If we go over to something like our clay loams, so think of your swale soils that have that heavier texture in between, you're looking at double that, so that 0.6 to 0.7%. So if you're looking for an opportunity to increase your carbon levels in your areas, look for your soil types with your heavier texture that have that more potential to stabilize that carbon in there. So be mindful of that. To give you an idea of carbon stock concentration, so this is again in the 0 to 10 centimeters, I've just made these generic numbers, which is just utilized a standard bulk density value. Karl was talking about bulk density before. Of a value of 1.4, which is on average for our Mallee areas, our average bulk density for the 0 to 10s, and multiplied that by 10 centimetres. So when we're talking carbon stocks, we're looking at probably a maximum of 5 tonnes of carbon per hectare, where our clay loams could probably get up to 10 tonnes a hectare. So that gives you an idea. Utilising data from the area, we are finding the biggest impact that we're noticing when we're measuring carbon stocks in that 0 to 30 centimetres is these difference between those soil textures. So separate your areas. If we're looking at sands on a mid-slope, or we're looking at the loams on the flats, regardless if we're in the Northern Mallee, Southern Mallee, Upper Southeast, or across an EP, we get roughly a 10 to 15 tonne carbon difference. If you're looking at sampling and you don't separate those out, you won't be able to pick up any fine-tuned changes in carbon. So sampling or any stratification, make sure texture is your first thing you're looking at. When we're looking at clay addition in our sands, so either clay spreading or clay delving, we found some rough rules of thumb. So in 2018, we went sampling in 49 clay modified sites, or over 15 sites, we had treatments. We did find an increase in carbon stocks across this area, averaged about 5 tonnes a hectare. Be aware though that the range was anything from negative to slightly higher, and the slightly higher occurred when we had organic amendments added in there. The key takeaways that we found though is that depending on your method, like clay spreading or delving that you might have, brings up different amounts of clay, but clay clod size was probably the biggest thing. So if you're looking to encourage carbon in these soils, you need to make sure that those clod sizes are as small as you can possibly get them. Carbon modification or clay modification is really quite tricky in areas below that 400 millimetres of rainfall. And that's really because the clay ended up looking for water, being a storage of water rather than a carbon source itself. And you can very quickly put too much clay on soils with low rainfall areas. As you get higher, you can have different factors that can improve your carbon concentrations, and this was nutrition, but we didn't often find extra nutrition are helping these clay modified sites. A meta-analysis done in a project with Soil CRC led by Richard Bell from Murdoch University. We were looking at the productivity and carbon benefits in sandy soils with either organic amendments applied or long-term amendments, and most of that was clay. We did have some biochar. So we grabbed as many projects as we could that had data that looked at productivity and carbon, and we ended up with a spread mostly centred around South Australia, but we had Western Australia, some in New South Wales and some in Victoria. Key findings from these are that climate, rainfall, no-brainer, productivity and carbon both increase with increasing rainfall. For productivity, the amount of rainfall that falls in winter and summer really had that strongest factor for improving productivity. For carbon though, it's really about a negative relationship between rainfall in summer. And that's what we were finding is the more rainfall you have in summer, the more active the microbes are. With warmer temperatures, you actually end up burning off your carbon rather than storing it. So if we have changing climate and we're actually having more of these summer rainfalls, it can be much harder for us to improve our carbon. Depth of sand that you have, so that depth before you hit a subsoil clay layer, has a really big influence on productivity and carbon. So both have a declining trend the deeper your sands go. What happens in some of the trials that they had where they added in clays or added in organic matter, not a great difference until you hit 90 centimetres. If you can apply organic materials, and most of these were manures, to the deep soils, your deep sands, you can actually keep your yield up about something that might be similar or might have shallower clay. For carbon concentrations, basically we've found this is mostly for clay addition. It isn't worth applying any clay if you have subsoil clay within 30 centimetres because there is no difference. You can get an increase in carbon where your subsoil clays are greater than 90 centimetres. How much clay to apply is another question. We've got productivity and we've got carbon concentration down the bottom. Productivity did increase to a point of clay concentration. Go over 15% and you're looking at declining productivity. However, the flip side is true for clay and carbon. The higher you go, the more carbon you're going to get. But nobody's going to clay when your yields are there. So if you're looking at low rainfall, concentrate on this 6 to 10 centimetres. You'll get a lot more productivity benefits than you probably will get carbon though. Interesting thing to fall out of this study was application of iron had a really positive benefit for both productivity and carbon concentration. So Murdoch University and Western Farmers Group, Western Midland Group, are looking at a trial now adding in products that have iron in there to see if they can boost productivity and carbon. A couple of things to think about for longevity of effect. Productivity changes happen really quickly. We can measure them within 2 years. Often they've stabilised again by 5 years. One thing to think about when you add organic amendments such as manures or compost is that you will often see an increase for 2, maybe 4 years, and then they will decline, often back to the level that they started. So this is when Karl was saying you have to have repeated inputs. And we often say about 450 to 500 mil, you'd be looking at 2 years repeat for doing that. Carbon changes take a long time to change. So expect to see low rainfall sandy soils periods of 5 to 10 years before you'll start to see changes. Western Australian data has shown that if you have clay amendments in there, these changes do remain for 15 years. So once they change, they are there. I'll quickly do this one and then I will just talk about it. We always hear increased carbon and you'll get increased productivity. For sandy soils, we seem to have these limits about areas below an area where we don't get an increase in productivity and areas above where we, again, don't get changes to productivity. And this is because below here, below this 0.75%, we're often below a critical value. That's where you're just getting soil function turning over. You're not getting a benefit for productivity. above 1.5%, it's stabilised. So you've probably got enough in there for your production then to be influenced by other things. But this sweet point between probably 0.75 and 1.5% is where you will start to see changes in productivity occur. This lines up roughly with the international literature where they use a 1% and a 2% as those boundary zones where you'll get that change in productivity. What can you do? Determine why you want to change carbon. Most of my focus for people is to maintain what you have. If you can increase it, that's fantastic. It does. There is a cost to increasing it for inputs and biomass. Maintaining numbers, it could be quite difficult going forward. Look at your soils. Look for those soils that have a little bit more clay in there to be able to hold that carbon. So your loamier flat soils are probably your bonus. Be realistic about how much carbon can be changed. There are a lot of factors that go into what can change carbon. Utilise some of those benchmarks, those ideas to get an idea of what range you might have. Carbon takes a long time to change, and really do look at selecting management practices that build carbon. I'm just going to finish off on this slide because Mallee Sustainable Farming has some fantastic options as well as the Soil CRC for reference information. So utilise all of those links that Felicity has been putting into the chat group as well. That's
Thank
me.
you so much, Amanda. They were two brilliant talks. We are blessed to have two experts like you guys working in our region. We've had a question come in on the chat. If we can now just shift into a Q&A session. So it's a question to both of you. If you owned a mixed farm in the Mallee, what would you do to protect or build carbon stocks, and would you register a project? So yes, sorry to put you under the microscope there, but what's your response to that one, guys?
Okay, mixed farm, are we talking about an ERF project? Are we thinking about a carbon footprint? Because that's slightly different things. ERF, we're often thinking about just focusing on that carbon change where you could potentially, if you're utilising manures in areas, you could potentially bring it back up. But if we're looking about carbon for carbon footprints with the emissions in there about offsetting those, it can be tough when we have livestock methane emissions considered in there. So rainfall is going to have a big impact on that. Your soil type that you have in there is going to. I often say below 400, 350 mil is pretty tough to be able to increase on sand. So Karl, I don't know if you got anything to add to that.
Unmute, sorry, Karl.
Yeah, I think that question is well along the lines, an implication of the sort of stuff we're talking about, and I think that's a definitely fair, good answer, Amanda. Another aspect might be around sort of emissions intensity, maybe emissions intensity and that sort of productivity. So all of those practices that are sort of suitable for an ERF scheme are all good agronomy. So address those things, address constraints, look to maximise production, look to loss was mentioned, definitely minimise loss. You don't want to lose your topsoil. That's the best stuff and it's most prone to loss. So look at those benchmarks about how much protection and cover and that sort of thing that you need. All of those local numbers that Amanda talked about are very relevant. If you're looking down, an ERF type approach, ask those questions that I talked about, and also there's consideration about not just looking to generate credits or generate credits to then sell and get money, but that's called an offset. You could generate credits and keep them, which is called an inset. If you sell them, they're not yours, but you're responsible for them. If you inset them, they're part of your system, and it basically gives you a lower emissions intensity. And that's attractive from a from someone you're selling to who wants to source low emissions products. It helps them. So they might have your system as a preferential supplier if you've got that lower lower emissions that you could justify.
Thank you, Karl. Great answer. I think we've probably only got time for this one more question. Given that soil carbon is hard to build in sandy soils and in low rainfall zones, I mean, I know this is a bit off topic, but are there other ways of improving carbon stocks on farms in our area that we should be looking at as an alternative to soil carbon projects? I guess I'm referring to storage and vegetation and the HIR projects and that sort of thing. Does that come up much in your work in extension in Western New South Wales, Karl?
It's not my area, so take that as one thing. The HIR, as far as I know, isn't available anymore. It might be part of a more rounded, what they're calling integrated farmland management, IFLM,
Yes.
Which is under development. And that sort of thing was looking at stacking different approaches on the same parcel of land. The reason it was discontinued was that they found that changes that were happening were not just happening where management was imposed, they were happening where management wasn't. So it was rainfall, which meant it wasn't the management. So what are you paying for? However, if you plant trees, say, then you've got a biomass that you can measure. Systemically, that has benefits for things like windbreaks. And it's a little while ago, but I remember seeing stuff from South Australia about the benefits to sheep production, like less mortality and better weight gain by having that sort of mosaic in your landscape and that sort of protection type areas. So that's another angle that isn't just about carbon, but about farm system.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, we're out of time. I think we will wrap up there. I've been furiously taking notes. I think I take from this that soil organic carbon is really low in Western New South Wales, in our Mallee area. It's hard to move it, but it's worth trying. We've got to deal with the constraints that we've got in our soils in order to build biomass, maximise and optimise the carbon we've got for agronomic reasons, as much as for any other reasons. In our area, it's going to be one of the tougher areas to run a soil carbon project. Do you agree with that conclusion? Not relative to other areas of other agricultural zones in Australia. We're going to be running more workshops across the Mallee on carbon accounting and learnings from the Victorian Emissions Reduction Action Planning program that they've been running. So please do look out for those workshops. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Thank you so much for your contributions, Amanda and Karl, and thank you everyone for joining us. We do have a short survey that you'll be automatically linked to as you leave the webinar. But thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.